Hi, welcome to our next webinar for the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition. This is Father George Williams, and I'm here today with Dr. Melissa Kelley, who teaches at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Also, Melissa and I are colleagues from BC, and we used to teach a prison ministry course together when I was working in Massachusetts. The Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition started about a year ago, and we decided we needed something grassroots to help people doing this ministry or interested in Catholic prison ministry to meet, to network, and to have resources in order to do their job and learn about what happens in jail and prison ministry. I know from my own experience, it's a very steep learning curve, and so we want to make sure we have the resources that will be available for everyone there. To that end, we have a new website that will go active in September. It will be catholicprisonministries.org. We'll have more information and we'll send that out as we get closer. But that will hopefully be your go-to place for all the kind of information you want. And just so you know, our mission statement is the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition promotes Catholic ministry to all those affected by incarceration. And that means not just prisoners, but families, victims of crime, staff in prisons. And our goal is to recruit, train, support, and empower those called to minister with the poor and marginalized. We hope to create a more just and merciful criminal justice system closely aligned with the ministry of the Church and the teachings and example of Pope Francis. CPMC will create opportunities to share resources and best practices to strengthen the Church's mission to advance restorative justice that upholds the dignity of every human person. So today we're talking about grief and bereavement as they relate to our ministry with those who are incarcerated, as well, of course, to their families and staff, and I suppose if we get to it, victims of crime as well. Melissa Kelley, that's her area of expertise, and so I'm going to ask her to give us a brief introduction to what we're talking about when we're talking about grief and bereavement. So Melissa, welcome, and glad to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time to share with us.
Thank you, George. It's my pleasure to join you, and hello to everybody who's participating with us. It occurs to me, George, maybe the first thing to say is, what is the difference between grief and bereavement? And some people use those terms interchangeably, but I like to distinguish between them as some people do. Bereavement means literally the state of being deprived of someone, being bereft. So when there's a death, I am bereaved of whoever it is who has died. But it doesn't presume that I'm having a certain response. You know, I could have a significant death and it may not affect me deeply for all kinds of reasons. You know, maybe I'm glad that this person is no longer suffering, etc. Grief, on the other hand, is, I think we can understand it as the distress in response to a significant loss. So when I actually am experiencing distress, that is what we mean by grief. And it can look a lot of different ways. For some people, their grief is primarily emotional. You know, they may do a lot of crying. They may feel very despondent. For others, it may not be. It may actually be more cognitive. They may be trying to figure out, you know, what's happened and what does this mean and how do I make sense of this? But if there is distress following a significant loss, that's what we can understand by grief. Go ahead.
And also, before I forget, those who are participating today live, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Feel free to open that box and to write down any questions or comments you have, because we'd like to have this be a conversation today. And also, we would like to be able to address specific questions and concerns that our listeners have when dealing with the issues around grief and bereavement in their prison and jail ministry. So any more to say about grief before I launch into my spiel?
Well, I thought maybe I would say just a word about, you know, what are the many ways that loss can occur? Very often we tend to think that grief is a response to death. And of course it can be, but it isn't always. You know, some people may, as I said, some people may experience a death that isn't especially distressing to them. So I thought, let me go to share, that I would offer this slide of types of loss. Did that come up?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the work of Kenneth Mitchell and Herbert Anderson, who are both pastoral writers. And this is their book, All Our Losses, All Our Griefs. And it's an old classic book, but this is one of the pieces that I think is most helpful about it. They identify 6 areas in which loss can occur. And there, of course, could be others. And there also can be tremendous overlap among all these categories. But for instance, material loss, and I'm thinking about incarceration. When someone is incarcerated and lose perhaps their home, their possessions, their car, their money, tremendous material loss. Relationship loss. We can experience loss through divorce, through death, but also from long separations, from ruptured friendships, from strained relationships. Role loss. When somebody loses their job or retires, even if they choose to retire, it can still be experienced as a loss to lose that role. And I think about incarceration, when you can't be with your kids every day or help them with their homework or help with discipline, what happens to your sense of your role as a parent? Systemic loss, this means the loss that an entire system or organization can go through. So for instance, what a family would experience when someone's incarcerated, they all experience loss. What a neighborhood could go through when a famous landmark is torn down or when the last mom and pop shop closes. Functional loss means loss to any part of our physical functioning. So serious illness, stroke, some sort of chronic disease that affects my physical functioning. I was thinking today about what would that mean in terms of incarceration, and I was thinking about the loss to whether you can even get fresh air when you feel like fresh air when you're incarcerated, or you have to eat when it's time to eat, not when you're hungry necessarily, but all those ways that the body is affected. And then finally, intrapsychic loss, by which Mitchell and Anderson mean the loss within our own psyche, the loss of a way of thinking about ourselves, the loss of a way of understanding how life works, the loss of a dream. Often the most difficult to sort of notice in ourselves and in other people because it's within our psyche. But any and all of these losses could be a source of grief for people. And again, some experiences, maybe such as incarceration, could tap into many or all of these.
Mm-hmm. Good. One other comment too, I noticed several more people have joined us since we began. And if you have questions, you can either go to the box in the bottom where it says Q&A, or there's also chat. And you can feel free to type any questions or comments there, and Melissa and I will see them and we can address them right away. As you're speaking, I'm thinking about the men and women that I work with in prison and how often there's layer upon layer of loss. Certainly the loss of freedom, but then once they're in there, it's very common for people to start losing more connection with family members, and people die. And one of the saddest things I have to do is notify people of deaths or serious illnesses in their families, which brings about often, seems to trigger a lot of shame in the men and women in prison. They often feel like they're guilty. And so I guess I'm curious in terms of how would you approach the issue around someone blaming themselves, feeling guilt or shame around not being there for a loved one?
So that leads me to something else that I was wanting to mention. Let me see if I can bring up this next slide. Well, I don't know how to advance the slide. So let me just go to talking with you. So one of the other areas in some of the newer grief work that we are understanding more and more about is the area of meaning making. That, you know, in the old days, and actually not so long ago, even, you know, if you ask people on the street, tell me something about grief, many people will say something about stages of grief, stage theory. We understand now that for a lot of people, that's not really what grief is about. What it seems to touch for many, many people is the area of meaning making. What does it mean that I'm going through this loss? What does my future look like? You know, where is the hope for my life, given that this has happened? And so when I think about something like shame or guilt, I'm not there for my family. One of the ways to think about that is specifically in this area of meaning making, that's a source of grief. I cannot be for my child the parent I want to be. And therefore, what does that mean for my child? And what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my life? So engaging with people in that area, I think, is just a really critical thing to do. And I think chaplains, prison ministers, are better able to do that than most folks. Okay, I'll stop there for a moment. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because I think a lot of people are grappling with trying to make meaning of the situation that they're in prison. And, you know, the system itself reinforces a sense of failure and shame and guilt. And so it's, which adds, I think, to just the complexity of what they're going through. So it's bad enough if you're losing a parent, but if you feel like your behavior has put you in a situation where you could not be there to be with them in their time of need, it's excruciatingly difficult. And I guess along that lines, I remember hearing about, you know, complex grief and also what that is, and also the idea that somehow we don't all grieve the same way. People have different reactions, and how do we know what is what do we look for, and are there things that we should be concerned about in terms of if someone is showing grief that is going beyond to where maybe we need to bring in mental health care?
So yeah, several important questions there. The first is, yes, grief is very particular. As I was saying about stage theory, there often is this sort of assumption in the culture that everybody grieves the same way, or everybody should grieve the same way. First there's denial, then there's anger, then there's bargaining, etc. We know now that grief is very particular. And as I was saying at the beginning too, for some people, grief is primarily emotional. They'll do a lot of crying. They want to talk about the loss quite a lot. For others, and men in this culture are socialized not to be emotional grievers. For others, grief is very active, or it's very cognitive. People are thinking a lot about what's happened, or they're working through their grief, literally sometimes. So grief is very particular. So the very first thing I think any helper needs to do is check their assumptions. You know, if this person doesn't look to me like they're grieving correctly, how do I think about that? Because I may be assuming their grief should look a certain way. Mm-hmm. But what you're also saying too, George, is sometimes grief does not run a course where it's going to move toward greater healing over time. So there's two things to think about there. First of all, sometimes people are experiencing both grief and trauma. And there's more work being done recently in the area of traumatic bereavement. This is grief that's laced with trauma. And that's not going to run the usual course that grief often runs, because there's also trauma there. And grief and trauma are not the same thing. So where we sense that this person has experienced trauma as well, they need help from a trauma specialist. And often people cannot get to the grief and do the grieving that they may want to do until the trauma has been worked with.
Well, that's a good point there. I was thinking in terms of what happens often with people who are incarcerated, who are then experiencing grief, is that their current grief or their current situation is triggering a lot of trauma that happened to them in the past, other losses. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but it made me think of that. And how can we be more attentive to sort of that idea of being triggered by old losses?
Yeah, which is not uncommon. Even leaving aside trauma, grief itself, if people have not had the opportunity or the support to do the grieving that they've needed to do, a fresh loss can stimulate all those prior losses. And when loss is compounded on top of loss, such as with incarceration often, I think, somebody could be living in chronic grief and have no support around that. So I think, the first thing that we can all do is, first of all, just be sensitive to how omnipresent grief often is. And I would imagine, of course, you know much better than I, but I would imagine in incarceration, that's almost a given, that grief is omnipresent. And second, because we often associate grief with death and not all those other categories that Mitchell and Anderson talked about, sometimes we don't recognize our own grief, unless someone has died. So being sensitive as a caregiver and asking at times, it sounds like there's been quite a lot of loss for you. I'm wondering if you have been experiencing anything that feels like grief or sorrow or sadness about that. Giving a person an opportunity at least to consider that.
Yeah. How about dealing with different cultures? I mean, I know from the dominant culture, and there's a certain way that I've been socialized to expressing my grief. But if I'm working with people who come from another culture, how can I be sensitive to some of those patterns? Is there any research that shows that people from different cultures have different ways of manifesting or expressing grief than people in the dominant culture?
Oh yeah, there's tremendous cultural variation in terms of how people understand grief and then how people may express grief. And it runs the gamut. So, sometimes people may feel like, and it may be related to gender, it may not, but sometimes people feel like it's not okay to express grief. I need to be stoic. Others may feel like culturally that they're supposed to manifest grief, all sorts of grief expressions and practices, even if they're not especially distressed internally. Mm-hmm. So there's tremendous variation. And I think one of the most respectful things we can do is just ask people, in your culture, what are your understandings about how grief is supposed to be handled or expressed, or what are you comfortable with, rather than our assuming.
Are there any resources that you know of that deal specifically, say, with African American expression of grief or experiences of grief? Because I realize also in that community, there's all kinds of levels of grief, almost universal, coming from the legacy of slavery and oppression, and also Latinos and Latinas, and how, so just, is there material out there that people can refer to if they haven't had direct experience growing up in those cultures?
Yeah. Fortunately, there is more and more that's being done on cultural perspectives on grief. I would suggest, if people are interested in this, in anything having to do with grief, that they go to the website of the Association for Death, Education and Counseling, ADEC. And I think it's adec.org. It is an excellent national organization that's doing all the most current work in grief, death and dying. And they have resources, and many of the better materials being done now on grief and culture are some of the folks connected with ADEC. So that would be a great one-stop shop to go to.
And what is that again, the title?
The Association for Death, Education and Counseling, and the website is adec.org.
Great, thank you. Well, we have one comment so far, and the person writes, prisoners have an automatic defense mode which prison forces upon them just to survive in prison. Trauma adds to this defense or makes it hard to assist. What are the steps, aside from being there, to better assist them as they experience grief? It's funny, I just was doing a training last week and this came up. One of the things I've experienced over the years, and please elaborate on this, Melissa, too, is when I deal mostly with men prisoners because only men are at San Quentin, but I have worked with women. But I find that when I've had to deliver bad news to prisoners, especially deaths in families, often people will react kind of with a stunned, kind of shocked, almost numb reaction and at that point I feel like they just need to process. And so my usual pattern is I will try to take them somewhere where it's quiet and dignified and let them sit down and tell them the news. And then sit with them a little bit, but not say anything or much. And then give them some time, give them an hour or two to process. They can go back to their cell or they can go to the yard, hang out, whatever they feel comfortable doing. And then go back in an hour or two. And by that point it's sunk in and they've gone through a couple processes where they're able to start relating to or talking about it. But I feel like to answer the person's question, I think prison does sort of force them into a certain kind of defensive mode. Some of that's also, I think, men in our culture don't want, it's for a lot of men, it's shameful to cry or to show those kinds of what would be perceived as weak emotions. And yet I find that invariably, if they have an hour or two to process, they're able to access those feelings. And any comments on that, Melissa?
Well, that actually sounds like a really helpful and sensitive way to proceed. I can well imagine, not from having done the work, but I can well imagine that being made vulnerable through grief is not ideal in a prison setting, that people have to maintain a certain defensive posture just to kind of get by. So being able to offer them some privacy, some place where they can both experience it and then pull it back together again. That sounds like a tremendous way to go.
Well, I think the key in all of this is, to the degree that it's possible in the jail or the prison that you're working in, first of all, I try to put myself in their place. How would I want to be treated in this situation? So you want to make sure that the person is given privacy and dignity. And so you don't want to tell somebody this news in a hallway through the doors of their cell. You want to give them, if it's at all possible, have this correction officers take them out of their cell and bring them to a place where they can sit down and talk. But you have to adapt, and sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes you have to tell them through a door of a cell if they're in solitary or something. And I guess in that case, you just have to do the best you can to be compassionate. Another thing I wanted to bring up is, and again, if people have comments or questions, please feel free to continue asking. Somebody just wrote, how do you help the prisoner who has been estranged through the guilt and shame they express upon hearing about the death of a loved one? I'm going to give that one to you first, and then I'll give my response. But that's a great question. Do you see it there, Melissa?
Can you read it again, George?
It's on the Q&A bar.
Part of my slide is cut off a little bit.
Okay. How do you help the prisoner who has been estranged through the guilt and shame they express upon hearing about the death of a loved one? So if somebody's kind of not had contact with their loved ones and then finds out someone died.
Yeah. Well, that seems to me to be a very sad situation. Even folks who are not incarcerated sometimes experience that. Someone dies and people have been estranged, or people have been distant, or people have been angry. And that's a very difficult situation. And it comes back sometimes around to that question of meaning. What do I make of this? It's too late now, the regret, all of that, which is a very sad thing. One of the areas in contemporary grief work that I think is actually really helpful is the area of continuing bonds. This is the work of Dennis Klaas and some other researchers who are demonstrating through research something that a lot of us have kind of known by just talking with people over the years, that when there's a death, not everyone, but many people will say that they feel that their connection with that person continues in some way, maybe because they believe in the afterlife, maybe because they feel the person is still with them in some way. Maybe they feel they now have an opportunity to embody something of that person as a way of honoring them. But this idea of continuing bonds, I think, is a source potentially of great hope for people, that even when someone has died, and we don't want to sugarcoat that and say, oh, but they're still with you. And so therefore you shouldn't feel guilt or shame. You know, we have to take seriously what people tell us. But even when there's a death, that doesn't necessarily mean the relationship is over.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's after death that people feel the freedom to engage, to talk with this person in ways they never could when the person was alive. So with time and with sensitivity, I think that's an area where people could find some solace and some hope, that there are ways maybe that they could make amends, that they could express their regret, their remorse, even after death.
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the things we have in our Catholic tradition is this notion of the communion of saints, and that we are connected to our loved ones still after death. And so I can see you don't want to sugarcoat or spiritualize it. However, it's a reality of our faith that
Right.
people are still alive in Christ and we're still connected to them. And I find that reassuring people of that is very helpful. And I also have experienced that through many of the prisoners, where it's not too late. It's, you know, we're still connected. Love doesn't die. And so healing and forgiveness and all those things can still happen, even though the person may have been completely estranged from them all their lives. And unfortunately, that's more often the case than not with many of the prisoners, especially the men, their fathers. So many of the men that I work with have had complicated, difficult relationships with their fathers, if they had any relationship at all. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, if it's not possible for the healing to continue after the person has passed, then I don't think we have too much hope to offer. But I think, fortunately, I think we do have hope because of our faith.
That's right.
So that's a great question. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. And I'll just add one thing. I think for some people, it sounds strange, but there's greater hope for a good connection after death.
Yeah.
Because the human connection may have been so difficult or fraught or painful, but right. Now it's a new day.
Yeah. And often I think because of many of the men and women that I've worked with, you know, the family members, often they die from overdoses or violence or even suicide. And that's another thing. It's like suicide's kind of a special case.
Yeah.
Do you have any special, do you have any insight or reflections to share on dealing with people who are survivors of suicide, who are incarcerated, or anywhere for that matter, but particularly those incarcerated, and also when a prisoner commits suicide, dealing with their family? Any advice on that? It's a horrible topic.
Well, that's an awful experience. So you mean when the person incarcerated loses a loved one to suicide?
Yes.
Or also when a prisoner commits or dies by suicide and you're trying to support the family? Mm-hmm. So often for survivors of suicide, that is a case of traumatic bereavement, because the circumstances of the death or just the reality of losing someone by suicide may rise to the level of trauma for a lot of people. So that's a case where people may need more than grief support. They may actually need some professional trauma response. But I also think there are many important, helpful organizations out there now for survivors of suicide. The American Association of Suicidology, there's many. And I also think for Catholics, there's still often this assumption about what current Catholic teaching is about suicide, that the loved one is in hell, that, they can't have a church funeral. These misunderstandings about contemporary church teaching. I think just relieving people's minds that, the Catechism, for instance, teaches that the church prays for those who've died by suicide. And we trust in a merciful God. So not to despair of our loved one who's died by suicide, but then also providing probably extra support for those folks, because it often does involve trauma.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Someone asked the question or makes a comment here. Grief becomes additive when a prisoner cannot attend the funeral. Do you have any examples for a verbal or ritual or some other method that the chaplain could provide the prisoner as their own ceremony to say goodbye? That's a really great comment and question. My experience has been that more often than not, it's impossible to go to the funeral. People in California, a prisoner's family can pay for everything, but it costs about $10,000 because they have to pay for the correction officers and transportation. So I've never actually seen it happen. But I think what I generally do after I go back, after the person's processed for an hour or so, definitely, I'll offer to pray with them and for the person and their family. And then, invite them to come to our service, in which case in the Mass, we either offer the Mass for the family and the deceased person, or include them in the prayers. So we find a way to invite them to come to our services and pray with them there or pray with them individually. I like the idea of doing some kind of a ritual. Do you have any thoughts about what that would look like, Melissa? Because I've never done that, but it sounds like a really good idea.
Well, I'm thinking often the most meaningful rituals are the ones that you've just named, prayer in a community, the Mass. But I'm also thinking of a experience that I heard, not in a prison setting, but a woman I know was chaplain to a man who was quite ill and couldn't get to, I forget the details, but he wanted to see his family member's burial site one more time before he died and couldn't get there. It wasn't possible. She led him in a guided reflection, visualization on what it would be like to be there at the son's gravesite. And she said it was incredibly helpful to him. Mm-hmm. I wonder if something like that would be possible in a prison setting as well, with certain people, but to guide people visually to imagine that they have been there, or to imagine that they're able to pray at the burial site, etc.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Another thing you could do, and I've always suggested this to the men, is even if they can't physically be there for the service, they can write something that could be either read as a eulogy or placed in the coffin with the loved one, and also encourage them the family to take pictures of the funeral and even of the gravesite. Sometimes that's as close as, especially if a person's a lifer, that's as close as they're going to be able to physically get. And then if you're allowed, given your various situations, if you're allowed, or your volunteers are allowed to accompany the family members to go to a service, as long as you have permission from the departments, that's a nice way to show support for the prisoner by supporting his or her family on the outside. And my experience in the past has been when I did that more in Boston because it was a much closer knit community and smaller geographic area, but it always meant an awful lot to the family members and to the friends of the prisoner and the deceased. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit, and we'll come back to this issue if there's more comments on dealing with prisoners and detainees experiencing grief. But I also want to talk about the victims of crime and how we might consider ways of helping them deal with grief, because my experience has been that a lot of the people who have been victimized by crime, especially victims of murder, carry on a tremendous amount of anger that gets in the way of their processing and healing. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on that, Melissa?
How to help people continue to kind of move on in their life after they've been victims of crime?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, not to not to be too repetitive, but again, that may touch on trauma. So people may need some sort of professional trauma support. But I also think that can be one of the places where the newer work in grief on narrative and narrative disruption might be helpful. And this is the work of some constructivist psychologists, including Robert Niemeyer and others, who are helping us think about the fact that most of us think about our lives in terms of a story. You know, we may not do it concretely every day, but you know, when we're asked about our life story, and that's often, even that phrase sometimes is used, we tend to understand our own life experience in terms of a story. Like, our lives have a plot. There was a beginning, you know, events have occurred, there's the present. There are characters, major characters, minor characters, protagonists, antagonists. We often think of our lives as having themes, you know, so, and this seems to be cross-cultural. People universally seem to think about their lives in terms of stories. And what that also means is we all have a sense of the future story we want to live. You know, it may not be all fleshed out, but if somebody asks me, you know, where do you want to be in 5 years or 10 years? I have clear ideas about that. And most of us do. So when something awful happens, like crime, like being the victim of a crime, one of the ways we could think about that, it's not the only way, but we could think about that as an experience of what Robert Niemeyer calls narrative disruption. The story I thought I was living has now been interrupted, disrupted. And the disruption may be greater or lesser in degree, you know, depending on all kinds of things. But for some people, it's almost like, you know, here's the book of my life. This awful thing has happened. It's like pages have been ripped out of the book of my life. And so for some people, it may even mean the future story makes no sense anymore. You know, you often know people are struggling with this when you hear things like, this doesn't make any sense, or I don't know how to make sense out of this. Part of what that suggests is people are experiencing narrative disruption, and they don't know what it all means, because story and meaning are intertwined. So for victims of crime, it may be that one of the areas that could be helpful is helping them actually think about what this has meant for their story. And then if somebody says, you know, well, the future I thought I was going to live is impossible now. How do I go on after this? Then we have some sense that it might be helpful to talk with people about story, you know, our personal story, but also story writ large. What is it that hasn't changed? What is it that I can count on in terms of my future, even though this has happened?
Good, thank you. And I've gotten a couple of comments as you were talking that people have found that description you gave very, very helpful, as I just did. Yeah. You know, one of the things that we do have to be aware of is that as chaplains in jails and prisons, while we may be focused on the prisoners themselves, we invariably run into contact with family members and also victims of crime. We have to be sensitive to them. Now, we may not be able to reach out to the specific victims of the prisoners that we're dealing with, but we don't have to do that ourselves. But we can set up having volunteers or people in our church or parish. That's a separate ministry, really, that the church needs to step up and do more with. Another area of ministry that we have not done much with, but it's really important, and I say this, I'm a little biased because I did my dissertation on this, but the area of working with staff. Often, I think when we walk into the prison, we come into an adversarial situation where we're there to help the prisoners, and it seems like, you know, the guards go out of their way to make it hard for us. But the reality is, we need to be really attentive to the correctional officers, the jail officers, and the non-uniformed staff, because they're experiencing their own forms of daily traumatization from being in prison, as well as loss in their own lives. And so any suggestions on how you think working with police officers or correctional officers and the types of losses that they experience in their lives. We could address that as chaplains. Any thoughts on that, Melissa?
Well, I'm wondering if, I have often found, again, that most of us tend to have a very limited understanding of loss. We think it has to do with death or maybe something like divorce. Most of us don't notice sort of the daily constancy of loss in our lives and in everybody else's lives. So sometimes just naming that for folks or creating space where people could reflect on that together. Like, I don't know whether it's even possible in any prison setting to have a gathering of some of the staff or correctional officers where they get to talk about that sort of thing. And, they're not told, oh, I bet you're experiencing this loss, but they're invited to reflect on, I was thinking earlier, George, like, and I don't know from the inside, but does working in a prison setting change someone's personality over time? Like, and maybe for the better in some ways, but just some of the factors that people are having to negotiate and deal with every single day. What does that do to one's basic temperament or personality? Like, would there ever be opportunities where people could reflect on that?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. And there's plenty of research that suggests that, yes, the prison environment does have a kind of a negative effect on people's personality development. And as well as the correctional officer culture lends itself to this sort of macho lack of expression of any form of weakness, because people who are attracted to law enforcement, whether they're police officers, correctional officers, tend to see themselves as people who are there to protect other people. It's a very altruistic motivation and something that I admire. But with that comes a sense that if they show weakness, somehow they're failing. Mm-hmm. They have to be strong all the time, and their own internal correctional officer culture reinforces that. So there are ways, I think, to while you may not be able to gather officers at work, it's extremely important to be aware of the things that are going on in their lives. Suicide among correctional officers is one of the highest occupational hazards. Another way to word that is that correctional officers have one of the highest suicide rates in the country. And so that's incredibly traumatic for their fellow officers when that happens. And unfortunately, it's not rare. Another thing that happens often is sudden death because of heart attacks or strokes. The average life expectancy for a correctional officer in the United States is 59 years. So a lot of these are relatively young people who either die toward the end of their career or very soon after they retire. So it's very important as chaplains that we be sensitive to that. And even if we can't be schmoozing with them in front of the inmates or the prisoners, we want to make sure that we, at least in some way, show them maybe off-site support or help them find the resources they need. Because a lot of these men and women really are hurting because they're daily experiencing a lot of the negative experiences, if not violence, at least the threat of violence in prison. Loss, they witness fighting, they witness suicides of prisoners, they witness blood and horrible things. So they're carrying around a lot. And I think it's really important for us to be very careful about that. Now, somebody else wrote here, as far as what happens to the story of a person who is experiencing loss, I find it helpful to present the concept of the risen Christ who is unconditional love present now and in the future. That may offer a new path of action. Yes, very much so. I think if we approach our work as Catholic prison chaplains and we're not grounded in the resurrection of Christ, then what are we doing? I think that's the good news we have to offer, is that prison, death, suffering, loss is not the final story, that the narrative continues. The narrative is one of hope, of resurrection. And again, I think we have to be careful not to go too quickly to that, so we sugarcoat the pain that people are going through. We cannot take away or try to diminish just the natural experience of loss and the suffering that goes with it. But I think it's really important that we emphasize our faith that in Christ there is victory over death, and that while we still go through suffering, it's not the end of the story for either them or their loved ones. So that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. This person writes, we talk a lot about the incarcerated. In our area, we're finding that there is little being done to support the families who have been left behind. And then I can't read the rest of their comment, but oh, there we go. The greatest problem seems to be connecting with them and encouraging them to let others who try to help. That's a really good point. The families of prisoners, in a sense, are incarcerated as well. I get calls almost every day from mothers of men sentenced to prison at San Quentin who are just freaking out because they don't know what's happening with their sons, and they're worried about them. They're mothers, that's their job. So a lot of what I have to do is try to, reassure them, try to go talk to the man and say, listen, have you talked to your mom? You need to write to her, call her. But it's absolutely important that we do that. And I don't know if you have any thoughts. I know, Melissa, when we taught the course at BC, we probably touched on this issue, but it's hard. That's one of the issues I think that we need to be attentive to in the CPMC, in the future with our website, is how do we connect people to the resources of helping families of prisoners? Any thoughts to add to that?
Well, I would add, as you know, George, I teach a course at Boston College called Pastoral Care of the Family. And one of the topics we take up, and you're a guest in our class by Skype, is the needs of families of the incarcerated. And I will say, when I have researched, church responses to families of the incarcerated nationally, there's actually quite a lot out there. I see many parishes of various denominations focused not only on the needs of the incarcerated, but on their families. And I always feel, none of us should spend time reinventing the wheel. So I think there are places out there doing this sort of work, and we can learn what they're doing and how it's working and borrow from them. So there's much to be done, as you're clearly naming, but I'm encouraged to see that there are groups taking this up.
Yeah, that's true. This person writes, the types of loss are cumulative, especially for those who have been in prison for so long that they are institutionalized. The issue around becoming institutionalized is something that is almost inevitable when you're dealing with people who are put in institutions like prisons that are really totalitarian institutions, and everything is done, all decisions are made, they're very disempowered. But I'm wondering, it raises an interesting question, is how does somebody who has experienced this sort of loss of agency through being institutionalized, how might their expressions of grief be different from somebody on the outside? Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting question. How would their expression of grief be different? If we think, the short answer is, I don't know, but I can speculate here a little bit, that if we go back to that idea of narrative and narrative disruption, to have lived in a setting where I have been stripped of the opportunity to kind of live my life in any sense, make my own decisions, eat when I want to eat, etc. Understanding how that has shaped my story, how I understand myself as a character in my own story, how I understand the plot of my life, that could be helpful. And then exploring options within that. I can't change the setting. If I'm a lifer, I can't change the setting of my story. I may not be able to change much of the plot, but how could I maybe focus on myself as a character in some different ways? Maybe feel like I have a little bit more agency, a little bit more hope.
Yeah.
That could be a way to frame it.
Yeah, I think that's good. What's sad is how disempowering and dehumanizing the experience of long-term incarceration can be. And so I think anything like that in terms of helping people sort of empower them to have their own narrative that's been perhaps taken away from them in the experience of prison is really important. I'm aware that we're down to our last 10 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, it would be really important to get them to us now. And also, not just questions, but if you have any of your own experiences of what's worked for you, that's helpful, because one of the things I'm hoping that on our website is, we'll have resources up that will kind of address these issues that we're talking about today, in addition to this training, which will be posted on our website, or catholicprisonministries.org, after this is over. So you can, if you may be joining us later at some future time and you won't be able to ask any questions, but hopefully you will be able to go to online and find the resources on our website starting in September. While you're with us, Melissa, do you have any suggestions for other resources for people to use in terms of literature, books out there that you would find helpful?
One of the areas that maybe sounds a little odd in a topic on grief and loss, but one of the areas that I find really, really important right now related to grief is the whole area of resilience. Because loss is inevitable. All of us are going to experience losses throughout life. Incarceration creates so much loss. And when facing loss after loss after loss, every one of us has to become as resilient as possible. And I think if there ever were a population that needs to be as resilient as possible, it would be those dealing with incarceration and their families. So what I want to say is, as maybe everybody has seen, there's so much work being done in resilience right now, in varieties of fields. But I think there's a special sort of opportunity for people in ministry to think about what are the resources of the faith, Christianity, that fold in beautifully, naturally, to everything we're learning about resilience. It's in a sense, it's all right there within the faith.
Yeah.
What research is now showing us supports resilience.
Yeah, that's a great point. Somebody else just wrote about the need for creating rituals for people who are not Catholic. And they ask if there's a way to do memorial services every 6 months in the prison to remember those who have died. We actually do that at San Quentin. We do regular memorials for prisoners who have died. And it's extremely helpful. And they're interfaith or ecumenical services. And we either do it in the Catholic or the Protestant chapel, because we're lucky to have 2 separate chapels, but it doesn't matter. I mean, anybody's welcome, and people are invited to bring in prayers from their own tradition, which raises a question for me, or for me to ask you, Melissa. We obviously we're talking about Catholic prison ministry here, but it's important for us to be sensitive to and aware of other faiths and their approaches to grief and dying. Is there anything out there in terms of literature that helps us understand how people in other faith traditions, Judaism, Islam, for example, how to be sensitive to their grieving and to their religious understandings of death?
Yes, this is another area that people are very interested in right now. The resources of religion, spirituality, and grief. So I would say, again, one of the best places to go would be to the ADEC website, Association for Death Education and Counseling. It's sort of a clearinghouse for a lot of this newer work that's being done very carefully. So that would be my recommendation.
And one of our attendees writes, I am presently using the book Tear Soup, Tear, Soup, S-O-U-P, by Pat Schweibert and Chuck DeClyon with her women. The book can be used with adults, children, and family members. And the story narrative describes grief. So the name of it's Schwiebert. And the other author is Deklyen, Tear Soup. Have you heard of that book, Melissa?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah. So that's good to know. And like I said, hopefully the more we have access to people's experiences around working materials out there, the better that we can put them on our website. One of the things that I think is very helpful are working in small groups with people. Often, if you are in a jail or in a prison and you have a group of prisoners or detainees who have experienced loss, you can have groups, bereavement groups, for people who are going through, want to share. What do you think about that? Any suggestions, Melissa?
Well, I'm sure you've found this in your work too, George, but one thing that we have to keep in mind is some people do not find grief support groups at all helpful. And in fact, they can add to their distress, because one of the things we often do in a grief support group is encourage everybody to share and talk a lot about their feelings and their loss. And because everybody grieves in different ways, that is not helpful to some people. It adds to their distress. Yeah. So one thing that's often helpful in a grief support group is having something for everyone. So for those who need to be more active in their grief and just don't find it helpful to do a lot of processing of feelings, to have sort of a task. What are the 3 ways I will try to take care of myself and my grief during the upcoming holidays? That's often a difficult time for folks. So people get to be concrete, they get to be thinking rather than doing a lot of emoting, but then create space for some expression of feelings too, for folks who need that, but something for everyone rather than just sort of a venting of feelings is often a good way to structure a group.
Good, thank you. That's really helpful. Someone writes, as chaplains, we obviously are focused on the prisoners, COs, and staff. Over time, we do develop relationships with these individuals. Do you have any suggestions for chaplains on how we support one another and ensure we do self-care in the case of a prisoner, CO, or staff member dying? So, great question. And any comments on self-care and dealing with our own grief and our own sense of loss when we're around people who are going through their grief?
Well, so self-care is essential, especially in these more challenging ministry settings. And I want to say that self-care is linked with resilience, that some people sometimes are a little hesitant to fully take on self-care because they don't have time, or it feels self-indulgent, or it's not their thing. But if people want to be able to remain resilient in the work they feel called to do, they have to understand self-care as a means of cultivating resilience so they can continue to do this ministry.
Thank you. We're down to our last couple minutes, and so I think it's time to wind up. And I want to be sure to take a moment to give a plug for our next webinar, which will be on Tuesday, July 9th at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. I'll be sending out a link in the next week or so. And the topic of the next webinar is how to create and sustain effective reentry programs for ex-prisoners. Our panelists will be Sister Maureen Clark, who is the Catholic Chaplain at MCI Framingham, the Massachusetts Women's Prison outside of Boston, and Father Dustin Fedden, who is a prison chaplain and pastor in Northern Florida, and the founder of the recently opened Joseph House, which is a facility of reentry for prisoners getting out of prison in Florida. And that's a huge area of need in our ministry. And so and they're both people that I know. Maureen was my first mentor when I was a Jesuit novice, and a wonderful chaplain and just a wonderful person. And she's had a very successful reentry program for the last 10 or 15 years at Framingham. And so I want her to share with us how she developed that and what some of the lessons she learned and what works, what doesn't. And the same with Father Dustin, who has also done a lot of work around reentry. So looking forward to that. That'll be Tuesday, July 9th, 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And again, we'll send you out the link for that. And then in August, we're going to be having another series of webinars on working with Spanish-speaking prisoners and immigrants and detainees involved in the current situation in our both ICE and in our regular prisons and jails. So a lot of good things coming down the pike, as well as our website for CPMC, which will be coming live in September. So Dr. Kelley, thank you so much for being with us. Melissa, it's
My
always great to
pleasure.
see you. And I miss working with you at BC, but thank you for the work you continue doing there. And thank you for all of you for attending, for staying with us, and for the questions and comments you made. So God bless, and we'll see you in July, God willing.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.